In your book, Cold Case Christianity, Jim, one of the points you made that I wished I'd heard decades ago was that the Roman Empire going in 70 AD and destroying the temple is nowhere recorded in the gospel. Therefore, they were written before 70 AD because they would have definitely, the Bible's a history book, they would have definitely covered that experience in the gospels.
Right. Well, I think part of what we're saying too is that I'm an accumulative case guy. So whenever I make a case in front of a jury, it's not on the basis. I've never had a case I can make on the basis of one piece of evidence. Right. We're going to present many pieces of evidence, all of which point to the same logical conclusion. So if it had just been that one missing piece of data, the missing no record at all anywhere of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, in, say, for example, the book of Acts, which records that period of time after the ascension of Jesus, that's where I would expect to find events like that. But you might say, well, look, I could see, though, why maybe Luke would leave that out. Okay, well, it's not just that one event. It's that he never mentions anything about that. And he says that Jesus predicted it. So it's not just that it's missing. The missing thing that would have proven that Jesus was an accurate predictor. So I would expect to find something, then I don't find it. And I also don't find the siege of Jerusalem, which occurred a few years before. I also don't find a record of the death of Paul. He dies, he's still in custody in the end of the book of Acts. He's not dead yet. We know he dies in custody. You know, he dies in Rome. Peter's death is in Rome. That's not also mentioned by Luke. James, the brother of Jesus, his death is not mentioned by Luke. That's around 61 AD in Jerusalem. Yet Luke has no problem mentioning the death of Stephen pretty early in history, and the death of James, the brother of John, that occurs around 44. So why is it that Luke is mentioning these minor players relative to the three most important characters in Christendom in the first century, which were James, the brother of Jesus, who leads the church, is the leader of the first church council in Acts 15, Peter, who you know is a leader of the church, and Paul, who writes most of the New Testament. Why would he not mention those? Well, all of this makes sense if none of it's happened yet. Now you can understand why it's not being mentioned. But that would place the dating of the book of Acts right about where we would expect it to be. Because remember, Luke says that he has access to those people who saw Jesus. He says this in the beginning of the book, Gospel of Luke. And we know that he slips into first person at a couple of places in Acts. So he's with Paul in that generation, which is right after the ascension of Jesus. And so we would expect him to have access to the very people he says he has access to. He leaves out the details you would expect him to leave out because he's writing early in history. And he lines up everything with Paul, who's writing letters that we know are early in history. We know 1 Corinthians is probably in the early 50s. We know the last letters that Paul writes are probably in the mid 60s. So we can date these things, and we end up with, unfortunately for skeptics, we end up with a dating for the Gospels, which is troubling because it's early. Because if you're going to lie about Jesus, just wait till everyone who knew Jesus is dead. Then you can say anything you want about Jesus. But if you're going to write about Jesus during the actual lifetime of eyewitnesses, both who are for and against you, well, that's a lot harder because it's harder to lie early. It's much easier to lie late. Because I think the early dating of the Gospels goes a long way to eliminate other skeptical claims. Because if it's early, then I would expect certain things, and I find those things in the Gospels, and so everything starts to line up. So that's one of the reasons why I took time to explain how early the Gospels were actually written.